your moderator, Frederick Shaw. I'm the editor-in-chief of Public Health Reports, the journal, the official journal of the U.S. Public Health Service and of the Surgeon General. I'm also a medical officer here at CDC and a former editor of MMWR. This is the latest in a regular series of webinars held by the publisher of Public Health Reports, ASPPH, and the Office of the Surgeon General of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This webinar is co-sponsored by NACCHO, the National Association of County and City Health Officials. Now, we've known for a long time about the difficulties that staff members in state and local health departments have in publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. I think everybody feels that there's a lot of valuable science out there, program assessments, case studies, commentaries that could be published and that maybe should be published, but are not being published. And this is not a new problem. But in the past year or so, there's been an increasing recognition of it, I think, and a movement toward ways to try to address it. There's been some movement, for example, in the national organizations such as ASPPH, NACCHO, and Council of State Territorial Epidemiologists, which we call CSTE, and the training done by specific publications such as my journal, Public Health Reports, and MMWR recently held a training. So there's increasing attention to this. For example, recently CSTE conducted a needs assessment of scientific writing and publishing among applied epidemiologists. And the results were published this month in the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice by Jessica Pittman and others at CSTE. The study found that many people working in state and local health departments want to publish in peer-reviewed journals, but they just do not or cannot for a variety of reasons. So the study found that there were major barriers to writing and publishing for people working at these agencies. The greatest barrier was time, just having the time to do it. But there were other barriers, such as a lack of encouragement or structure from the agency, a lack of knowledge on how to write or how to submit, and even a lack of access to the peer-reviewed literature itself, which you need. So our seminar today is intended to help you, the audience, who are public health practitioners in the field. We want to help you turn your work into manuscripts for peer-reviewed publication. We only have an hour. It's not a long time, and clearly we can't give you anywhere near a course on writing and publishing at this seminar. Instead, what we want to do is just try to orient you to a general strategy for designing, writing, and submitting an article for peer-reviewed literature, and how to position it. I call it positioning. So it's attractive to journals, peer reviewers, and ultimately, of course, the most important audience, the readers of the articles. So after this seminar is over, ASPPH plans to follow up with you, the people who have signed up for this seminar, where you have your email addresses. We know who you are. For example, ASPPH plans to let you know about efforts of various organizations, including ASPPH itself, and publications that will help you to get started. We'll give you some resources in that email. Joining me today is a truly expert panel. 4 people who I would say are on the cutting edge of peer-reviewed literature and expert in scientific writing and editing. Starting to my right, first is Dr. Peter Drotman, who's editor-in-chief of the journal that he's holding in his hand, Emerging Infectious Diseases. It's an open access, peer-reviewed, high-impact monthly journal published here at CDC. Peter became editor-chief of the journal in 2001. In his previous career at CDC, he's been an epidemic intelligence service officer. He's worked in environmental health and HIV/AIDS prevention, and before coming to CDC, he worked in the WHO smallpox eradication program. To Peter's right is Dr. Leonard Jack, Jr., the editor-in-chief of the online journal Preventing Chronic Disease. It's another open access peer-reviewed journal published here at CDC. Leonard became editor recently in 2016. In his previous career at CDC, he's been director of the Division of Community Health in CDC's Chronic Disease Center and the lead scientist for community intervention at CDC's Diabetes Division. He's also held several positions in academia at Xavier University of Louisiana, Jackson State University, and Morehouse School of Medicine. He's also served as an editor-in-chief, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Health Promotion and Practice. To Leonard's right is Dr. Paul Siegel. Paul is currently the Deputy Associate Director for Science at CDC's Center for Surveillance, Epidemiology, and Laboratory Services, the same center where I work. Our doors are close together. During his CDC career, he served as a medical epidemiologist at CDC's Chronic Disease Center and Field Epidemiology Divisions. He's a highly experienced teacher in scientific writing. And since 1999, he's conducted scores, hundreds, I don't know, trainings on that subject for public health people in the U.S. and around the world. And finally, out in Seattle, joining us by remote telephone line from Seattle, Washington, is Mr. Tom Lang from Tom Lang Communications and Training International. Tom's an author's editor and an international educator in medical communications. In the past, he's worked as the manager of medical editing services at the Cleveland Clinic and at the New England Evidence-Based Practice Center at Tufts University. His two books are, first, How to Report Statistics in Medicine, second edition, 2006, and the second book, How to Write, Publish, and Present in the Health Sciences, 2010, both published by the ACP Press. He served on many standard-setting groups for medical writing and publishing. He's the past president of the Council of Science Editors, and he's the current treasurer of the World Association of Medical Editors. And the standard disclaimer on behalf of myself and the other federal panelists, I should say that the comments we're making here are those of the panelists and do not necessarily represent the official position or views of CDC or HHS. Okay, I've done that. We're going to experiment a little bit for this seminar. In previous Public Health Reports seminar webinars, we followed a strict lecture format, and we decided to go crazy this time and make this one unscripted and unrehearsed. We have not rehearsed. Do confirm, gentlemen. And we are not even going to present any PowerPoint slides. Almost heresy, but we're just going to have a conversation. And we prepared some questions to get the ball rolling, but we want you in the audience to send your questions into the panel. We'll run as many of them as we can. To do that, here's what you do. Type your question into the chat question box, which is opened by clicking the small white arrows that are in the upper right corner of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can during this short time. So let me start with a question. Let me toss this one to Tom Lang out in far away in Seattle. Tom, you're an epidemiologist. Assume you're in the field. You've been working on some interesting scientific issue or program, maybe an interesting outbreak or an interesting program assessment, and you're thinking about writing it up for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. What are the first things you should be thinking about? The classic advice is that editors want research that is new, true, important, and clearly reported. But I think the question that has always resonated best for me is something Arnold Relman said at the New England Journal of Medicine. He said, when I pick up a paper, the question I ask myself is, how will medicine or public health be different if I publish this paper? Well, what are your thoughts on this, panelists? What do you think the first thing, it has to be important work, right? We've been talking about that as we were waiting to go on. You have to have something important to say, correct? It has to be important to somebody, not necessarily to everybody. So know your audience, and anytime anybody in a public health arena takes some action or solves a problem or investigates a problem that they don't solve, it's going to be interesting to somebody. It may just be in that county, or it may be a much broader audience. When you figure out who can use the information you have uncovered, then you can start thinking about how to get that information to those people. Is it all about putting yourself in the place of the reader, would you say, Leonard? Yeah, I think that's important. What I was going to add is that any author has to be familiar with what has already been generated and what has already been published before, because the intent is to add to that body of knowledge, but not necessarily to repeat it. And finding your place in the body of work is really critically important. And then what you can do is make the case for how it's filling the gap, how it's moving the field forward, or how it complements what we already know. I think those are some of the things that, and you often use the term, it's got to fill a, as you say, fill a gap, or how does it add? Paul, any thoughts on? Yeah, to reinforce that, it is critical and essential for a paper to have something new in it. It does not have to be revolutionary. It doesn't have to be something that's so creative that nobody's ever thought of it. It can be a modest step forward, but it has to be a step forward. And that question of determining whether something is new, to implement that requires doing a thorough literature review. Now, that may be obvious to many, but it bumps directly into what you said earlier is the major constraint of people who are public health practitioners, and that is time. So if you're a public health practitioner and it's not your job to publish, how do you find time? And that's very difficult to do. And so I would say one potential scenario that can alleviate that, I'll call it a problem, is to reach out in the early stages of planning the paper to people who are subject matter experts in that area who may already have a broad grasp of the literature. If you can, let's call it, pitch your paper to somebody, and the initial pitch might simply be asking a question that you're wrestling with, but if you can develop a relationship with a subject matter expert who already has a broad grasp of literature, you might save yourself tens to 100 hours of work.
One of the issues that you raised there, to be a good scientific writer, you have to be a good scientific reader.
Yeah.
So you get to know the structure of the papers and how the messages are presented to the readers by reading the work of others. Scientific writing is not creative writing. There is a standard structure to articles that is generally expected, and you will figure that out after you've read 5 or 10. But after you've read a great many more, you'll get a lot more nuance.
What about, now, if you start thinking about publishing at the tail end of an investigation or a program assessment, is it a little bit late at that point? Should you be thinking about that at the very beginning?
Yeah. It's never too late.
Yeah, I would say it's never too late.
It's also never too early.
It's never too early. And, I wouldn't say but I would say, and if there are intentions to publish, there are some core elements that must be a part of a manuscript, depending on what type manuscript you're intending to publish. That's helpful to know it in advance so that you have all of that going on with your project so that you can capture that, right, and have it reflected in your paper. And I just think that given that some thought early in the implementation of any intervention, any investigation, will better position you later on to have what you need to generate a solid publication, and depending on where you want to send it, right? Yeah, I'd just like to add that the idea to publish something that you're working on can come up at any point in the process. You may have been planning to publish from the beginning of the project, or you may learn something in the process of doing something which makes you think, or a light bulb goes off and say, well, I just learned something that's new, it's new to me. Well, then at that point you need to go do that literature review and find out whether it's just new to you or whether it's new more broadly than that. But at whatever point you make the decision that you're going to, or that you're interested in writing a paper, before you write the paper and even before you do data analysis, it's critical to think about the strengths and limitations of the data that you have. Because in some cases, the limitations of the data will be so severe that you don't have much chance of accomplishing a publication. And one of the most frustrating things that I hear people talk about is they've spent many, many hours working on a paper, they've sent it to 2 or 3 journals, it's been rejected repeatedly, and then they show you what they've done, and we talk about the limitations of the data, and it was very predictable before they even wrote the paper that it would probably not get published. So assessing the strengths and limitations of the data before you start writing the paper, I think, is one of the most important time management strategies. Let me ask this, and maybe I'll toss it to you, Tom. When writing for a publication in a peer-reviewed journal, you have a lot of years, decades of experience. What are the biggest mistakes that authors make?
Well, I think the limits of the data is probably the biggest one. The other, I think, is a certain lack of awareness of a reader. All too often, authors do what I call a data. They put everything they know about their research into a paper without trying to meet the reader's needs for information. I think the final thing is that most people sort of write okay, but that means that the density of information is not going to be great in a scientific article. And the need to think critically about the presentation of the science is just as important as thinking critically about the science itself. So spending time on the paper and revising, and getting feedback.
The other thing is not having data. Sometimes papers are submitted and it needs more data, or there's an absence of data that speaks to the question that they're trying to address in the paper. And in addition to that, sometimes authors don't know the scope of the journal, right? They're submitting papers that's outside of the scope of the journal, or they identify an article type that doesn't align with what story it is that they're trying to tell. And this is one that's a pet peeve for me, is when papers are submitted that's written by multiple authors, and they're each having a conversation, and it reads as if it was written independently by 4 or 5 different people kind of brought together, and it's not seamless, right? And that typically sometimes happens with authors who don't have a lot of time. They sort of divide the paper up in some way, and then they kind of pull it all together without having a core message that comes through when that actually happens. I mean, I think the last thing is not being patient enough in the process of writing that is done in a rushed way and something that's submitted. Writing takes careful thinking and thoughtful time put into it to make it comprehensive and thoughtful, and it shouldn't be rushed.
Build off of Leonard's comment, if I might. The journal editors I work with in WAMI are universal in saying that read the journal's guidelines for authors. That not only indicates the scope of what your article can be, but also the format in which you submit it, all of which, if you follow, will make editors typically pretty happy.
And it's important to get help early on. I mean, I think a lot of the papers that I see are papers that, had the author taken the advice that Paul just mentioned, get to an expert, really spend some time with somebody who can mentor you about that particular paper, who can review it, and before submitting, I think makes a huge difference. Would you agree, Paul, on that?
Absolutely. And there is a caveat or maybe even a pitfall associated there. And that is, there are times when very, very solid, experienced subject matter experts will agree to participate in a paper, but they may agree to participate and actually not carefully read the paper. And so I would say, if you're a junior person and you need support of a subject matter expert, by all means look for somebody of that nature to help you and to work with you. But be careful and critical of their contributions to the paper. Don't just assume that they have carefully thought everything through.
We're talking about mentorship, really. When I think back on my career, going back a long time at CDC, the mentors that I had who looked at my lousy papers and commented back and forth, and over a period of time, gradually learn how to do this thing. Do you see that in your career?
Not all the authors take ownership of all their papers. It's shocking. That's very important. I would refer folks to the ICMJ, the International Conference on Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE.org, and they list their specific criteria to define who is an author and what it is you have to do to honestly list yourself and your colleagues as an author on a peer-reviewed paper. And I know our journal, I believe all the journals represented here, subscribe to the ICMJE policies. And actually there's a great wealth of information at that site, not only on authorship, but on ethics and informed consent and a whole variety of issues, how to do group authorships and things. It's a great resource.
I want to mention, too, something I found very useful. It's a new book by Steven Pinker called The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. In Chapter 3 is called The Curse of Knowledge. The main cause of incomprehensible prose is the difficulty of imagining what it's like for someone else not to know something that you know. I think a lot of the people who do really well in writing are people who are able to put themselves in the position of the reader. But if you go into writing with the curse of knowledge, it can be a big hindrance. One way to combat that is by having a colleague who doesn't know anything about the subject you're writing about read the paper, maybe 2 or 3 colleagues, and comment back to you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I always encourage, particularly authors who have not generated a paper that would be submitted to a journal for peer review, to approach someone who's done it before and ask advice and get some counsel on just overall what the experience is like. There is a culture to writing. There's a culture to submitting to peer-reviewed journals, and it may be very, very different from authors who've not gone through that experience before when you're generating a report that you submit on the job. But, you know, sharing your ideas initially before you even start writing with someone that's gone through the process that can help you go through some of the things that Paul just mentioned. So I think it's a mindset piece here. And then the other thing, too, that's important is that, particularly for people who haven't done this before, I'll say this very quickly, is to find the right article type that meets you where you are in terms of your time, your skill set, and what it is that you're trying to convey. So maybe you're not at the point where you have rich data that's clean enough or developed enough to do original research, but maybe you have enough experience from in the trenches, the work that you're doing, to do an essay, or to do a commentary, or to do a special topics, right? But just finding some place to start where you can do a credible job, but there's not a stretch for you, and you can have a mentor, someone you can share with that can kind of help you learn from the overall process.
Well, let me turn to questions from the audience. The first question we have, and I'm seeing here on the screen, is how do you decide which journal you should send your paper to? Do you decide that before you write the paper or after? Peter.
There's an earthquake going on in the journal publishing world, and it is called open access. So the traditional business model of journals is a publisher publishes a journal and sells it to those who wish to read it. And the subscribers pay for that privilege. The authors, scientists, or public health investigators, whatever, pay nothing. They give the manuscript to the publisher who then sells it to the world or to the libraries. Open access reverses that, where the authors actually pay the journal to peer review, and if it's peer reviewed, then they cash the check, and the journal is published, the article is published, but it is then made free of charge available to anyone who wishes to read it. This is catching on quite a bit, and it is very attractive to those who sponsor research, such as universities and funding agencies, and they have built those charges into the research grants. Public health department may not have a budget to pay for that sort of thing, but research places and many others do. Yeah, the high one rate I've seen is close to $5,000 for an article, and that's in the Lancet Global Health.
You have to take that cost into account. If you're in the field, there may not be a fund to pay for
That might not be your journal if you're broke.
Tom, let me ask you on that. What goes into selecting a journal?
Well, I think it's honesty. Most readers are familiar with the journals that they read, of course, and they can look at the references and see related journals in the field. And most people tend to have an order of how those journals are ranked in terms of importance. And however you want to measure that, circulation or frequency or impact factor or whatever. And then you sort of need to decide where in that range your research fits. And then I would suggest that they read the instructions for authors for that journal, and maybe one on either side of it, to to see if there's a match between what they want to publish and what the journal's interested in publish.
Very important to read those instructions to authors, right? Right, Paul? I mean, important to decide before you write the article. Yeah. Because, a couple of examples, if the journal allows a maximum of 3,000 words, and I write a 3,500 word article and send it off, well, it's not going to matter how well it's written. They're going to reject it. Like AJPH allows only 180 words in the abstract. If I write an abstract with 250 words and send it to AJPH, they're not going to take it, and I've now got more work to do. So it's critical to me. Or it might get bounced back to you instantly without even being processed. I think that's exactly right.
I think all journals do, decent journals do a really good job of letting readership and authors know the core topic areas that is of interest to them. And to submit something that is not among those things that's a part of the core topic areas for that journal is a big mistake. It's wasting your time. And then the other thing is becoming familiar with the journal to get a sense of what, over time, are the kind of themes that you see appearing in that journal. So you will know if your work will resonate with that journal or not. That goes beyond just knowing the themes, but actually doing a search within that journal to see, on this particular topic, what has this journal had to say? So that you're not submitting something that has been published previously, but then you will see what is of interest to the journal and how to maybe build upon that.
From the point of view of somebody just starting out, writing their first paper and trying to pick a journal, I guarantee there is a journal somewhere that will publish just about every paper.
Yeah.
And there is a subcategory of journals that we are calling predatory journals that are there to collect those author fees and won't do bona fide peer review, but will indeed post the paper on their journal website. These are usually very low impact and a very low trustworthy kind of journal. So be careful when you investigate. Some of these predatory journals co-opt the names of reputable journals. And I speak from personal experience. The journal I had is called Emerging Infectious Diseases. There is a publisher out there that has attempted to clone our name and add the word journal to it and charge people thousands of dollars. Our journal has no fee. And by the way, we have the CDC lawyers going after them because we're a registered trademark and they're co-opting it. But they are literally publishing thousands of journals, and many of them with these bogus but similar names to real journals. So be careful if you don't know the field and you don't know the reputable journal, investigate and talk to colleagues who do know those fields.
Now, let me ask this. Maybe a difference of opinion here. What about sending a query to the editor-in-chief? Hey, I've got this. Does everybody, Tom, I think, are you skeptical of that? Do I remember that?
The journal editors I've talked with say, don't bother with the query, just send us the full paper. Mm-hmm. That way they've got it and they have all the details. So just my experience with the editors I've talked with.
I'm a little different. I think that if authors are interested in getting a real clear sense if it resonates with PCD, that we have developed some guidance on what to submit to us in 300 words or less to give us an opportunity to review it. My position is I would rather you know before you submit the manuscript to us whether or not it is something of interest to us. It could be that it is a fine area to write in, but we published enough on it. And it's just a courtesy, and it is really taking off, people taking full advantage of it. Yeah.
How about do you answer query letter?
We do. We have the email box where authors can propose submissions, either abstract, a title, a topic, but if somebody just sends an email saying, I have a great paper, would you like to receive it? We're skeptical.
Yeah.
Well, we have another question from the audience.
One of them was about IRB.
It was about IRB. That one disappeared, but I do want to cover that. What about IRB? Paul, maybe do you want to tackle that one? Do you need to have IRB approval when you submit? I can tell you with public health reports, basically the answer is yes. We, and all the SAGE journals do require that you have a statement of ethical Yeah, I think I'd punt that over into...
The way the question is framed is we view IRB approval as a burden to overcome. That's not a good way to approach IRB issues. Number one answer is don't do anything unethical. And if you don't do anything unethical, you will get a proper approval. You do have to present your package of research to an independent review board, and virtually every peer-reviewed journal in the world will require that approval and the name of the board that gave that approval be included somewhere in the manuscript. So it is, in the history of science, there have been some abuses. We just noted the 40-year anniversary of the Tuskegee research that was probably done by very well-meaning people who had lofty goals, but it was done in such a way to disregard the welfare of the patients, even though none of the researchers intended to harm those patients. But by withholding treatment for syphilis, they did suffer harm. And now it's viewed as a teaching lesson in virtually every medical ethics course. Now, IRB approval is a way to get experts to prove your research and to make sure that it is publishable. And you shouldn't view it as a burden. You should welcome it as a kind of help.
Yes, and journals are getting very, very strict about that. In the very first contact you'll have with a journal, they're going to want to know about the ethical aspects. Let me turn to another question. Help. How do you get help? Let's start with editorial help. We sort of covered scientific help. The scientific help is going to come from your environment, your agency, and maybe an expert, as Paul pointed out. Many authors might not have access to an author's editor or something like that. The big journals don't worry about that. Some of the very big journals, if they get an article that's great scientifically, but not written very well, maybe by a non-native English speaker, that's not a problem. They have a room full of manuscript editors to fix it up. But that's not true for a lot of journals. So
That's a Tom Lang question.
I was just going to say that. This is a Tom Lang question.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. Well, I like Tom to take the first half.
The editing that's done at journals is mostly copy editing. There's simply not enough time to move deeply into an article to find out what's right with it or what's wrong with it or what's missing. I think the salient point that I would like to make here is the growth of language polishing companies, which emerged to meet the need of non-native English speakers publishing in Western journals. And they promise that your article will not be rejected because of the English. But the assumption is, at least in Asia, is that if my article is edited, it will be accepted. But there are hundreds of these companies, and they range in quality from, I think, fraudulent to probably pretty good. But you have to be careful because they can be expensive. Take the premium service if you use it because you want the deepest edit that you can. And just remember that they're being edited not by professional editors, but typically by graduate students in the field who certainly can comment on the content, but may not be specialists in the reporting of that content.
At a minimum, right? Papers that are submitted can benefit from a colleague or someone that has the ability to ensure that the tense, for example, in papers is correct. There's just a minimum thing that could be done to improve the readability of papers. And when that's not in place, it's a barrier for the peer reviewer because it just can't get past some of the real basic things that go along with constructing an appropriate sentence. So I think you said it before, too. It's okay to have someone else to look at your work, right? Someone that hasn't seen it before. And people can look at your work differently for different things. One person may look at it for content, and then there's someone who's going to look at it just to make sure that the sentences, there are complete sentences that are there, right? I mean, it's just really, really critical. And then some journals do go a little deeper behind ancient papers beyond just copy editing to actually look at tables, to look at figures, to look at they're being presented appropriately or if they're being captured appropriately in the narrative in the paper itself. But at a minimum, someone can look at that paper for you and say, that sentence or that paragraph just did not make sense. And here's some thoughts on how to improve it.
Yeah. Oh, you teach this.
No, I'd like to add that there are certain things that authors can do to help themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I've seen lots of papers where the stated purpose of the paper in the abstract is not only different from the stated purpose in the introduction section of the paper, it's actually not even consistent. There are certain structural elements to a coherent paper that authors can check for themselves. I've even seen papers where the title of the paper actually diverges from the content of the paper.
Yeah.
And so one thing that authors can do to help themselves is to cross-reference the different components of the paper, some of which should have very, very specific relationships with one another. Another example is sometimes the conclusion statement in the paper is unrelated to the purpose statement of the paper. All of these things are points of connectivity within the paper that authors can check for themselves to see if they make sense.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you have a very good science and maybe novel, interesting, important finding, but it's written in a way that's very hard to understand, kind of like what you were saying, Leonard, you're not going to do particularly well if the editors and peer reviewers are having difficulty just understanding it. So, yeah, Tom, how much does it cost to hire, a good editor to help clean up your paper?
A lot. I'd like to respond to one thing, is that when you deal with editing, sometimes it's the errors of omission that are the biggest ones. And that's why it takes time to go through the paper. It takes me between 5 and 7 billable hours, that's stopwatch hours, to edit a paper. If you look at the salary schedule of the American Medical Writers Association, you'll find editing fees from $75 to $120 an hour. And for that, you should expect to get a thorough review, not only of the language, but all the cross-checking, formatting of tables and figures. If you're lucky, some comments about the research designs and activities or the statistical reports.
All right, well, let me turn to another question from our audience. Here it is. How much time passed is too long for data in your paper? So the audience member is asking 2 years, 5 years? How old is too old for data? Anybody want to jump in?
That's a real layered question.
That's not a simple answer.
That's not a simple answer. It could be that the data is old but still current in that it hasn't been analyzed, published, and reported yet. It could be that the data is current, but it's a data set that someone has basically milked and used and published from a lot extensively, really doesn't add any value to the field, then I would say no. I mean, that's a very difficult
answer. Depends on what you're doing with the data.
Yeah.
If the county health department has investigated a foodborne outbreak in their county, then after a month, nobody's going to care about it that much anymore, and that's too old. We're still publishing data that was collected in the influenza pandemic of 1918. We're still digitizing and analyzing some of those data, where 50 million people died in 1 year. So there's it's a sliding scale there.
I think the authors have to make the case for why they are
old data.
Yeah, why old data is still good data. Yeah.
Another factor here, Fred, is certainly how old is the data is a factor, but it's also how much time has elapsed since the end of the data collection period and when it's submitted for publication. Generally, good papers are published first, and if you've collected data from 2000 to 2012 and you're just now submitting it to a journal 5 years later, the first question is, well, what's wrong with this? Why wasn't it published earlier?
That brings me to the question of cover letters. I happen to be somebody who loves a good cover letter, and I read every single one of them quite carefully. And for me, it's an opportunity for the author to say, hey, Mr. Editor, here's why you should pay attention. Do you all feel the same way?
I'm with you. I enjoy reading the cover letters. And I read 99.9% of all of them. And they help tell a story for me. And there have been times, similar to what Paul just shared, where the authors are saying one thing about the focus and intent of the paper that's very different from what the paper actually reflects, right? But I think you get a sense of why the paper, the topic is of interest, and why the authors think that it's of interest to the journal and to the field. That's usually where that's captured. And it sets the stage for me before I look at the paper, and it helps me anticipate what's in the paper. So the cover letter to me is very important.
To me, it's almost unimportant. I generally don't look at them unless I have some reason or question that I think the answer might be in there. I look at the abstract.
The abstract. Mm-hmm. But is there some place maybe in the latter part of the introduction where you hope that an author will make their case, this is the first time that, or this is why this is novel, or this is why it's important, stated explicitly?
Well, at our submission portal, which is online only, we have a required one-sentence statement of importance of this paper. So we have that. And some authors will also put that in their cover letter. We also have a place where authors can nominate reviewers that they think would be suitable. Other journals have that in their cover letters. So we sort of have specific blanks that authors have to fill in for the information we think is of particular importance. Usually the cover letter will say, we certify that all the authors are bona fide authors and that we have not submitted this to another journal.
Mm-hmm. So the cover letter, last I checked the instructions for authors at AJPH, there's a statement saying that cover letters can be helpful in choosing articles for peer review. Well, to me, that means they actually screen articles using the cover letter, and I take it to mean that if they read a cover letter and they don't have a positive impression, they will not read the paper, they will not read the abstract, that they sometimes will reject the paper based on the cover letter. Wow. We'll be hearing from AJPH on that.
That's exactly what I was going to say. So you have heard from Peter that he made infectious disease. That's not important to EID. For PCD, having a cover letter that is substantive and informative is very important.
Let me move on to another question from the audience. Time is flying. Tips on finding authors to collaborate with in your field. That's probably for a junior investigator. How do you find other authors to collaborate with?
Well, that's part of doing your basic research. You're going to know the topic that you're working on better than most people. If you're looking to approach experts, you go to the literature, read some articles. Some of those authors are going to be professors at universities or health officers. You can try writing to them, calling them, emailing them, or sending them your research that you've already done and saying, I'm interested in collaborating with you. But that's sort of a separate from the main topic we're dealing with today. That's how do you get research done? Yeah. Because if you're looking for authors who haven't worked on your research project, well, that's not right. You're supposed to, the people who did the work are supposed to be writing the article.
Tom, any thoughts there?
How to find colleagues?
Yeah, find colleagues or find mentors, maybe. That would be another way to say it.
Well, I think Peter's right in terms of finding, co-investigators. Finding mentors, that's tougher. I will tell you that a bunch of senior writers in the Medical Writers Association were talking, and it turns out that the agreement was that all good writers had worked for an extended period under a mentor with uncompromising standards, and that was essential
Absolutely.
to learning how to write well, because it takes time. And how you find a mentor, probably the same places you look for co-investigators.
Mm-hmm. You're getting general approval here, Tom.
Yeah. I would just add too, in terms of finding someone to co-author with, is to you reach out to individuals and have conversations about what you bring, the strength to a potential collaboration, and being someone that's going to do research and write together, and the other individuals will share what they bring to the table. And hopefully there's a good fit, right, where everyone finds a unique way to contribute that everyone feels comfortable with, that everyone feels as though everyone is adding value to the process and not a burden in some way.
I'd also add that the time to look for authors is before you do the research, not before you're writing the research.
One thing I'd throw into the mix there is that as a federal employee, we have an obligation to respond to any request from anybody in the public. And if you think of it from that perspective, and you say to yourself, here I am working at a state health department, it makes a lot more sense for me to make a cold call or send a cold email to somebody at CDC with a question than it would for just somebody asking just any old question. So I would love for people in health departments to actually feel that CDC has an obligation and in most cases is actually willing and enthusiastic about supporting activities at health departments. That doesn't mean automatically they would go after your paper, but in terms of responding to a question that might enable you to initiate a relationship that might develop into a co-authorship, I would encourage people at health departments to think that way.
I very much agree.
.gov has the phone number of every single HHS employee. There is nothing secret, proprietary, or hidden about it. You can go to the CDC, you can make a comment on the web. Well, that gets directed to somebody who triages it, and I'm not sure how reliably that will get you to who you want, or somebody who would make sense. But if you're working at a health department, you're in a pretty good position to find out who is an appropriate person. You can go to hhs.gov and call that person on the phone, and I think you should feel comfortable doing it.
You can also call 1-800-CDC-INFO, NFO, and they will take down questions and farm them out to various CDC divisions. They track who answers them. Okay, so they are almost guaranteed of getting some kind of response.
Right.
May or may not be good.
A young investigator, I think, should feel, you find a name on PubMed in your area and you're thinking about doing a project or writing up something, absolutely be bold. Just absolutely email. Way more to gain and almost nothing to lose. Yes. All right, now we have a question about the dreaded topic of impact factor. What about that, Tom? Should a author think a lot about impact factor before they submit?
Well, they do. Whether they should or not is highly controversial. The correlation between expert opinion of a journal and the impact factor is only modest. And we have to remember that the impact factor applies to the journal, not to individual authors who publish in the journal. Yeah. That said, there's a loose relationship between how people see the importance of a journal and its impact factor. So typically it's going to be, journals with higher circulation, more frequency, higher rejection rates, and so forth. I'm not really sure how to answer that question. It is critical in Asia, in China, because you get a certain amount of money if you publish in a journal with an impact factor above a certain threshold. So if you get published in Nature or Science, that's worth $30,000 bonus. Well, I think there are other factors that are probably more important than impact factor, in particular the journal's instructions for authors.
You have the highest impact factor in this room right now. Do you want to comment?
The impact factor is sort of the most widely followed index of journal writings, but it's certainly not the only one. The other things to consider is what is the circulation of the journal. You get a paper in it, how many people are going to read it, and how many people will be able to read it. Other outfits have made their own factors. Perhaps the easiest one for people to look up is called Google Scholar Metrics. They made up their own factor called the H5 index, which looks back 5 years. And like impact factor, which rates pretty much all journals, Google Scholar Metric only gives you the top 20 in each field, but they've got zillions of fields. So if you look up Google Scholar Metrics and start looking at journals, or look at topic areas, you'll find journals, and you can usually get to the list of papers that have been the most highly cited. And speaking for our own journal, we have one of the top ratings in the communicable disease area, and our Google Scholar metric H5 number is 74. That means we had 74 papers with more than 74 citations. And if you click on 74, you get a line listing of every one of those papers. So you can see which is the most highly cited one. You can do it for all journals, not just ours.
And just to add a few things, I think that this is always an interesting topic, right? And I think for my journal, we're okay. We're pleased. We would always like to do better. But the one thing that I'm starting to look at is the uptake of papers once they're published, because there's one thing to have something cited, like which is in the academic realm, right? Your paper's most cited helps with the impact factor. But to actually go a little bit further than that and begin to understand what the work that we're trying to do in the journal is to influence practice, right? So we look at also the number of downloads that happen with papers, and then also if we see work that's being captured in these papers influencing practice in the field. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is to make sure we put good research, good evaluation, good practice in the hands of people in the trenches who are trying to make a difference. And is that happening or not happening?
And there's not a great measure for that.
No.
It doesn't. An article might be never cited, but could be highly used.
Yeah. I think the opportunities to with our awardees, for example, CDC awardees, to find ways of getting this good work out and trying to influence the uptake of it. We don't want using things that don't work or we don't know work, but if we know some things that do work, we want to kind of nudge you in that direction. And I think there should be and can be ways up the road to begin to assess whether or not the uptake of that is actually happening. And we're starting to see people make decisions about programs differently than calling your peer and say, what are you doing? Can you send me what I just saw a brochure, right? No, it's using a different body of knowledge to shape how interventions or programs are developed and implemented and evaluated. That I think is going to be important.
I just wanted to add, there was a follow-up question from the audience about how do you identify predatory journals, and it can be hard. There used to be a professor at the University of Colorado, Professor Bell, who listed them, but they sued him, and for $1 billion, by the way. And I don't know, the suit went to trial, but he had to take a list down. The flip side of it is there is a reputable outfit called the Directory of Open Access Journals, DOAJ, and they list the good journals, sort of a white list, for the journal's name on others. They have standards such as bona fide peer review, and everybody who is listed on the editorial board has agreed to be there, as opposed to some people who've been hijacked and names have been put on the editorial boards of predatory journals, but they never agreed to do that.
Well, I wish we could go on there. We could easily go on another hour. There are lots of questions we didn't have time to get to, but that's all the time we have. As I mentioned, you in the audience will be hearing from ASPPH by email in the next several days as a follow-up. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, all of you in the audience. A special thanks to our fantastic speakers here and in Seattle for their time and sharing their insight and expertise. I also want to thank ASPPH. I want to thank NACCHO and, of course, the Office of the Surgeon General, my boss, for its continued support. A special thanks to Larry Thomas and the CDC expert broadcast staff for managing this production, which was technically quite difficult. To Erin Williams of ASPPH for her great work on the webinar series and on this one. To Oscar Allen of NACCHO for his able assistance. So this is the end of the Public Health Reports, How to Get Published in Peer-Reviewed Journals webinar. As a reminder, this webinar will be archived on the ASPPH website for future viewing. That website is www.asppph.org. Thank you, everyone, and good day.